The city street was alive with the usual hum of busy commuters, the air thick with the scents of coffee and fresh pastries from the nearby cafes. Pedestrians hurried by, their eyes focused ahead, lost in the rush of their daily lives. The world moved fast, but at the corner of the street, a figure sat unnoticed. Mark, a homeless man in his early 40s, sat slumped against the brick wall of a small coffee shop. His tattered clothes hung loosely on his frame, and his hands trembled slightly as he clutched a worn blanket around himself. His face was weathered, marked with the hardships of a life no one ever seemed to care about. His shoes, barely holding together, had seen better days. He gazed across the street, observing the hustle of the busy world around him. People walked by without even sparing him a glance. It was as if he was invisible to them, just another forgotten soul in the background of their busy lives. Mark had grown used to the isolation, the way people hurried past him without even acknowledging his existence. He had lived on the streets for years, scraping by with whatever he could find, surviving on scraps. There was a quiet pride in his resilience, but a deep sadness too. He remembered the days when he had been someone else, someone with purpose. But that was long ago. Now he was just part of the backdrop, a ghost among the living. As Mark sat there, he noticed a black luxury car pull up to the curb across the street. The door opened and a man stepped out, Richard Anderson, a well-known billionaire. His crisp, tailored suit stood in stark contrast to the worn-down surroundings. Richard moved through the crowd with ease, his sharp features and confident stride leaving a trail of admiring glances in his wake. The contrast between their worlds was undeniable. Richard was the embodiment of success, a man with everything at his fingertips, while Mark was forgotten, discarded. Richard didn't even glance in Mark's direction as he strode past, his focus solely on the coffee shop ahead. Mark felt a pang of bitterness, of envy perhaps. How could someone like Richard, with so much wealth and power, ever understand what it was like to be invisible, to be ignored? But then, something happened. As Richard crossed the street, he suddenly staggered, his face contorting with pain. He grasped his chest, and before anyone could react, he collapsed onto the pavement. His body crumpled like a rag doll, and a collective gasp filled the air. But no one moved to help. The people around him paused for a moment, confused, but then continued on their way, lost in their own lives. Mark's heart raced. For a moment he couldn't move. He had seen so many people walk past him, not even acknowledging his pain, but now someone who had everything, someone like Richard, was lying helpless on the street. And for a brief fleeting moment, Mark wondered if anyone would stop to help him either. But Mark's instincts kicked in. Despite his own struggles, despite the years of being overlooked, he couldn't just sit by and do nothing. This man, this powerful, wealthy stranger, was in trouble. Mark had seen enough suffering in his own life to know what it meant to need help. He rushed forward, stumbling over his own feet as he approached Richard. Kneeling beside him, Mark gently touched his shoulder. "Hey, are you okay?" he asked, his voice trembling with uncertainty. Richard's eyes fluttered open, confusion clouding his gaze. He looked up at Mark, clearly disoriented. I need help," Richard gasped, his breath coming in shallow bursts. Mark didn't hesitate. He pulled out his phone with shaking hands, dialing for an ambulance. As he did, his mind raced. This man, this billionaire who had passed by him countless times without a second glance, was now relying on him. The world around them seemed to freeze in that moment. The hum of the city faded away, leaving only the sound of Richard's shallow breaths and the distant ringing of the phone. Mark didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. His life had just intersected with that of a man who had the power to change everything. As Mark waited for the ambulance to arrive, he realized something. This moment, this act of kindness, would set off a chain of events that would change both of their lives forever. The wail of the ambulance's siren pierced through the air as it screeched to a halt beside the sidewalk. Mark's heart raced, his palms slick with sweat as he watched the emergency workers rush out, their faces focused and urgent. Richard lay still on the pavement, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Mark's hands trembled as he helped the paramedics lift Richard into the ambulance, his eyes glued to the billionaire's pale face. He couldn't believe what had just happened. The man who had walked past him countless times without so much as a second glance was now relying on him, a homeless man, to help save his life. Mark climbed into the ambulance, his heart pounding. He had nowhere else to go, no one to call. His life had been spent in solitude, abandoned by society, but in this moment, he wasn't going to leave Richard's side. The paramedics worked quickly, connecting Richard to oxygen and monitoring his vitals. But Mark's mind raced. The stranger he had just helped, who before today was nothing more than a faceless, wealthy figure, was now alive because of his actions. It felt surreal, like something from a movie. The ride to the hospital was a blur, the flashing lights outside casting shadows on the walls of the ambulance. Mark sat at Richard's side, watching the man who had seemed so invincible just hours ago now vulnerable, struggling to breathe. It was hard for Mark to reconcile the man in front of him with the image of Richard he had always seen. Strong, powerful, untouchable. When they arrived at the hospital, the doctors quickly moved Richard into an intensive care unit, and Mark was told to wait. He sat in the sterile waiting room, still in his tattered clothes, feeling the weight of the moment. Why had he stayed? What was driving him to care for a man who had everything while he had nothing? Was it just instinct? Or was there something deeper at play? An hour passed, and Mark's mind began to race. He wasn't even sure if Richard would wake up. He had no place to go, no family to turn to. And yet, here he was, waiting for a man he didn't even know to recover. The world outside seemed to move on, oblivious to the life-changing events that had unfolded in that small corner of the city. Finally, the doctor came out and told Mark that Richard was stable. He was still unconscious but alive, thanks to Mark's quick thinking and immediate help. Mark let out a breath he didn't even know he was holding. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Hours later, Richard woke up. His eyes fluttered open, and he stared at the ceiling for a moment, as if trying to remember where he was. Mark was sitting beside him, his gaze unwavering. Richard blinked, confusion clouding his face, before he turned his eyes toward the man sitting next to him. The realization hit him like a wave. You saved me?" Richard's voice was hoarse, and his expression was one of disbelief. "But you're a homeless man." Mark nodded, his face soft but humble. "I just did what anyone would have done." Richard's mind raced when still grappling with the absurdity of the situation. A man from his world, someone who had spent his entire life surrounded by wealth and luxury, was saved by someone like Mark. The contrast was jarring. Richard had expected someone from his circles to help him, someone important, someone who could do something for him in return. But this man, this stranger, had no reason to help him, no motive other than basic humanity. Mark's words hung in the air, leaving Richard with more questions than answers. Why had Mark been so selfless? And why was he still here, despite having nothing to gain? As the reality of the situation settled in, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that he had just experienced something that would change his life forever. The hospital room had become a place where Mark and Richard's worlds slowly began to collide. The days passed and Richard's health improved, but it wasn't just his physical condition that was changing. Something deeper was unfolding between the two men. What started as a simple act of kindness had blossomed into something neither of them had expected. Mark, who had spent his entire life trying to survive in a world that often overlooked him, found himself sitting by Richard's bedside talking. At first, their conversations had been brief, small talk and polite exchanges. But as the days wore on, the walls between them started to fall. Richard listened, truly listened, as Mark shared his story. He spoke of a time when things were different, when he wasn't living on the streets, when he had a family and a career that seemed promising. Mark had once been a young entrepreneur with big dreams, dreams that had seemed within his reach. "I used to have a company," Mark explained one evening, his voice quiet but steady. "I built it from the ground up. I was making a decent living. But life can change in an instant. My business failed after a series of bad investments. I lost everything. My home, my friends, my family." He paused, looking out the window as though searching for something, anything, to hold on to. One bad decision led to another, and before I knew it, I was on the streets. Richard sat in silence, his gaze fixed on Mark. He couldn't help but feel a deep sympathy for this man who had fallen so far from grace. But there was something more, something about Mark's resilience, his quiet strength, that struck Richard deeply. Despite the hardship, despite the loss, Mark hadn't given up. He still believed in kindness, still helped others when he could, and somehow still held on to hope. Richard found himself growing more and more moved by Mark's story. He had never truly understood what it meant to lose everything. He had always had the privilege of wealth and security, never once having to face the kind of struggle Mark had endured. But now sitting here, hearing Mark's pain and strength, Richard realized that there was so much more to a person than their outward appearance or their wealth. Mark's kindness had saved his life, but it was his story, his spirit, that truly resonated with Richard. One evening, as Mark sat by Richard's side, he could sense the billionaire's contemplation. The silence hung between them before Richard finally spoke. "Mark," he began, his voice firm yet filled with sincerity, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said and about what you've done for me. You've shown me more kindness and selflessness than anyone I've ever known. You deserve more than what life has given you." Mark shook his head, not fully understanding what Richard meant. "I don't need anything, Richard. I've made my peace with where I am." But Richard was insistent. "That's not enough. I can't just let you go back to your old life. You've got something in you that I want to help you harness. I want to offer you a job at my company." Mark's eyes widened in surprise, but he quickly shook his head. "I can't accept charity. I've been down that road, and it's not the way I want to rebuild my life." Richard leaned forward, his voice steady and persuasive. "It's not charity. My company is hiring people who've had difficult circumstances, people who are willing to fight for a second chance. I see something in you, Mark. You've got the potential to do great things. You just need the right opportunity." Mark hesitated. The thought of returning to the corporate world was both terrifying and tempting. He had spent so many years fighting to survive on his own, rejecting any offers that came his way. But Richard's offer wasn't just about money. It was about hope, about the chance to start over on his own terms. "I'm not asking you to be my charity case, Mark," Richard continued, his voice softening. "I'm offering you a chance at a new beginning, a chance to rebuild your life with dignity." Mark's heart pounded as he processed Richard's words. The offer was a lifeline, one that he never thought would come. For the first time in years, he could see a path forward. But could he take it? Could he trust this billionaire, this stranger, to help him when he had always relied on himself? It was a moment of choice, a moment that would change Mark's life forever. And as he looked into Richard's eyes, something deep inside him stirred, a spark of hope that he hadn't felt in a long time. Mark's first day at Richard's company was a whirlwind of emotions. He had walked into a world so different from his own, a world of sharp suits, polished floors, and quick decisions. At first, he felt like an outsider, unsure if he truly belonged. But something inside him clicked when he set foot in the company's headquarters. He remembered his past, the drive he once had, the dreams he had lost, and he realized for the first time in years that he could rebuild everything he had once thrown away. Despite the skepticism he had toward the offer, Mark poured everything he had into his new role. He worked tirelessly, learning every facet of the business, asking questions, and gradually earning the respect of his colleagues. They had all seen his humble beginnings and doubted his potential. But as time passed, Mark's resilience began to shine through. He wasn't just a homeless man who had gotten lucky. He was a force, a problem solver, a person who had faced hardship and emerged stronger because of it. Slowly, his work ethic and humility won over even the most skeptical members of the team. But the real turning point came months later, when Richard called Mark into his office. Mark, still getting used to his new life, had no idea what was coming. He had been working on a project for the company, one that would change the direction of their operations, and he knew it had the potential to elevate his standing. But the words Richard spoke next left him speechless. "Mark," Richard said, his voice calm but filled with purpose, "you've done more than I could have ever asked for. I've seen the way you've transformed this company, and I've seen the way you've transformed yourself. I'm proud of you, so today I'm making you a public announcement." Mark's heart began to race. Was he about to be fired? Was this a formality? The tension in the room grew thick, as Richard paused for a moment. To everyone's surprise, Richard continued, I'm appointing Mark as my right-hand man. He is no longer just an employee of this company. He is now a co-owner. Mark's mind spun as the words sank in. A co-owner? Was this some kind of joke? He was still the same man who had slept on park benches just months ago. How could this be real? Richard smiled as he saw Mark's stunned expression. I'm not giving this to you because you need it, Mark. I'm giving it to you because you've earned it. You've earned my trust, the trust of the company, and you've shown the world what true transformation looks like. The news spread like wildfire, and soon the entire company was buzzing with excitement. Mark, the once homeless man, had become the face of redemption, a living testament to the power of hard work, humility, and kindness. Months passed, and Mark's transformation became complete. He stood before a new office, an office that had once been reserved for Richard's closest associates, a space that he now owned alongside Richard. As Mark looked around the room, the reality of it all sank in. His life had changed. The man who had once had nothing now had everything. His dignity, his purpose, and a future that was entirely his to shape. Richard stood by the window, watching Mark as he took it all in. Mark, he said, his voice filled with pride, never forget what kindness can do. It's not just about wealth or power, it's about changing lives. And it all started with you choosing to help someone when no one else would. Mark looked up at Richard, a quiet smile crossing his face. He had gone from the streets to the boardroom, not because of what he had, but because of who he was and who he had become. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time in his life, Mark truly felt like he belonged. And with that, he knew that anything was possible. The event hall buzzed with anticipation. The crowd of employees, clients, and investors sat, their eyes fixed on the stage. Mark stood at the podium, his heart racing, but his mind clear. It wasn't just another company event. This was a moment of transformation, a moment to share the story that had changed his life and could change the lives of everyone in this room. Mark took a deep breath and began. Years ago, I was sitting on the street with nothing to my name, no hope, no direction, just survival. But then a moment happened, a moment that changed everything. I saw a man in need. He could have been anyone, but to me, he was a symbol of everything I thought I would never become, a man who had it all. Mark's voice wavered slightly as he looked out over the audience. I helped him, not because I thought it would change my life, but because that's what humanity is about. We help each other. We lift each other up. And in that moment, I didn't know that one act of kindness would lead me here, to stand before you as someone I never thought I could be. The room was silent, the weight of his words settling in. Mark paused, his eyes sweeping across the room. Helping Richard Anderson didn't just change his life, it changed mine. It showed me that no matter where we start, we all deserve a second chance. It's never too late to make a difference. We're all capable of greatness, even when it seems impossible. As he finished, Mark felt the quiet strength of his own story, knowing it was a message that would resonate far beyond these walls. The journey of 1,000 miles truly began with just one step.